we've ever done something like this, people interested in Dalcroze histories in Canada. So we have enjoyed our opportunity, and I'll explain a little bit how we're going to present and how we hope you'll join in the last part of our session. So in the first part, we're going to showcase the teaching lives of 3 pioneers and their contexts, 3 who are no longer with us. And after that, we're turning to continuing and very active and evolving Canadian Dalcroze stories. And we will hope that you join in some exchange of memories, perhaps, of the people we will have first spoken about. And then we'll talk about ways of sharing our background stories of others as well. So I'd like to introduce the panel. Our first speaker is going to be Dorothy DeVal, who is a pianist, a musicologist, one of my good colleagues at York University in Toronto. And the next will be Gilles Comeau, who is who teaches at the University of Ottawa and coordinates the music education program in the School of Music, and is the director of the Piano Pedagogy Research Laboratory there. And my name is Selma Odom from York University. I'll be the third of the first presenters in this sequence. But we thought we would begin by jumping into the past with a look at some unique film footage that the first of the pioneers had a chance to make. And the first is Madeleine Boss-Lasserre, who came to Canada in 1924, began to teach in 1925, and filmed her first students working with her in 1935. I think in the abstract it says 1937, but in fact, when we transferred from the original 16mm print a few weeks ago, we were able to see a date even earlier. So this is 1935 film made in a garden in Toronto. And it's a little 2-minute segment from film footage that is longer. We have actually 3 reels of film from Lasserre's collection. So we have some film from the 30s and some film from the 40s and early 50s, all of which will be edited and I hope deposited in archival safety in the future. So she was able to view this with me at one point, this particular reel, and therefore I have a sense from her directly of how they made the film and how they viewed it and what is in it. When they got together a few times to play this film made by an amateur filmmaker named Narcisse Pelletier, they would join up with one of their colleagues who would play the piano. So they would actually watch the silent film with musical accompaniment. So you have to imagine that. Actually, in one of the other reels, you can see him on the side playing for them outdoors in the garden while they're filming. So you have to imagine the music today because this is silent film. She said that this first little segment that you'll see are little moments from a Bach fugue. It's the C sharp minor from Book 1. And then you're going to see a plastic counterpoint exercise in which you will see clearly 2-time, 4-time, 3-time, and 5-time. And then finally, there are 2 exercises called conducting with the body. The first is actually her stepdaughter, Marguerite Lasserre, conducting 2 people. That's very short. And then the high point is seeing Madame Lasserre conducting 2 larger groups. And if you've seen the micro exhibit over at the library, you'll see a still frame from that part of this film where she's sort of ready to conduct the two groups. So I wanted to tell you these sort of things to look for, and I'll try to play it now. So these are some moments from Bach. She's in the middle. Woo. Fugue. Okay, so that's it. So this is quite exciting to be able to share that, because we were able to have it digitized directly from the original 16mm print by a new technology that has just come into being quite recently. So,
where in Toronto was that?
it was in Rosedale.
Oh, I was going to
Near
say.
Milkman's Road. You'll appreciate it. And when I first received these films from her, I could take a walk right on that road and look into that very garden and see where they filmed it. But later, it grew up and changed. But the other film is from Mimico, and so you see the beautiful lake. There's actually some color film from later on. But it's quite moving, I think, to see these people and to see the work she had been doing with them, because within 10 years she had very strong connections with some of her advanced students. Are you connected?
Well, you've already had a little bit of an introduction to Madeleine Boss-Lasserre, who is the subject of my presentation. I'm very grateful to Selma for having persuaded Madame Lasserre to leave, not to throw out all her records, because she moved around, and you know what it's like when you move house, you want to get rid of all the clutter. Fortunately, Selma persuaded her not to do that, and so a lot of that clutter, which is actually a complete, not quite complete set of notebooks, but her teaching notes and demonstration notes, are now in the archives, the Clara Thomas archives at York University. So when we were talking about doing this presentation, I thought, well, it would be great to do something on Madame Lasserre, because there's not an awful lot about her in the literature, and there was this wonderful collection of material in the archives. So little did I know what sort of awaited me as I started going through the boxes and boxes. And really this presentation is kind of a distillation of, not really the contents, because there's really just too much there. Would be the subject of another paper, certainly, if not a dissertation. But really just to sort of fit her into, as you said in the introduction, into the context of life in Toronto for the 50 years that she taught at the Conservatory, and she's lived in Toronto substantially longer. So that's kind of where this presentation is. You've seen pictures of her dancing. These are readily available photos that I found. She was always known as Madame de Serre. So I thought that picture on the right sort of was appropriate. The evolving institutions of Toronto, particularly the Conservatory and the University, really went along with her life, and this is why it's quite important, I think, to look at her life in conjunction with that history. I do have a very slight personal connection with Madame de Serre, nothing like as strong as Selma's, but I did study with her briefly when I was a piano student at the Conservatory in the 1960s. I was automatically placed in one of her many classes. I could find my name in her little notebook where she kept meticulous attendance. I had a eureka moment when I found my name there. I was only allowed to attend for a year because we were all on these programs and courses. And I remember being very disappointed because I loved those classes. But I had to be transferred out. I probably went into keyboard harmony or something like that. But as I mentioned, the history of the Conservatory where I was studying and the university where I studied also kind of went hand in hand with her history as well. She was born in Switzerland, in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, and at the age of 18, she was encouraged by her piano teacher to study with Dalcroze in Geneva. After certification, she accepted a domestic position in Toronto, and then met and married a fellow Swiss, Henri Lasserre, who had a position as a professor of French at Victoria College, although he was trained as a lawyer. He was divorced and several years her senior. He retired in 1942 and I believe died in 1945, so she was widowed for quite a long time. But Marguerite was a stepdaughter and took part in her classes, so that name comes up quite often. In 1925, she accepted a position at a progressive school called Margaret Eaton School, which taught physical education and dramatic art. I've highlighted the Dalcroze there. A year later, there was a lot of change in management at this time. It was still theater. A year later, it became physical education, and she became part of that. Note that they mentioned Dalcroze there. But really, her real career began here, which is the old building of the Toronto Conservatory of Music. This is what it's like it's now. It's like now that building is on it. So, I mean, that looks quite different. Of course, I'll show you a picture of the next one. All right, and then at the same time she was appointed, the Conservatory had appointed a new principal, Ernest Macmillan, one of Canada's most distinguished musicians, organist, composer, conductor, pedagogue, and administrator. He ardently supported Dalcroze rhythmics and was instrumental in her appointment. The Conservatory's lecture hall was filled to overflowing for her first demonstration, one of hundreds. And a year later, she organized another larger one in Convocation Hall, so that's the central and prestigious hall in the University of Toronto, this time with Paul Vogel, who had just been appointed head of the New York Dalcroze School. So there's I'm sure he's familiar to most of you. There was an announcement there, and you'll note that that particular event was sponsored by the Dalcroze Eurythmics Association. And I found a list of their membership. There were 43 members. It's in those many boxes that I went through. And the Macmillans were there, both the Serres, various colleagues, one of whom was actually a friend of my parents, Scott Malcolm, who played with Reg Godwin for years. So I began to feel more and more personally attached to this story as I went through the boxes, and people in the musical community. Important person in this story is Boris Blin. One of her colleagues, he was appointed a year later. He certainly was very supportive. He knew her well. They both spoke French. You'll probably know Boris Blin as a prolific teacher and publisher of sight reading and pedagogical methods for piano. He composed, he wrote. He emigrated from Russia in 1919, first to Switzerland. He studied in Geneva, interesting coincidence, and also at the Hochschule in Berlin. I was actually Boris Blin's pupil for 13 years. And I knew that he was aware of the guy who was rhythmically incorporated. I think my first lesson, I remember, for some odd reason, we were moving up steps and stuff like that. So it wasn't a huge part of his pedagogy, but he was certainly aware of it. He also, much later, Boris Blin had a very long career. He was teaching virtually up to when he died. And he also taught sight reading in university performance courses. And what did he use? For rhythmic exercises, he used Dalcroze. And he sent everybody into a spin. I mean, they loved it, but it was, it wasn't something they were used to doing. So I thought that was great. He was using it right to the end. Back to the conservatory, I put a little arrow showing where it was located. It was at college and university where that present Hydro building is now. So quite a central and prestigious location. But it's important to know, I went through a lot of the conservatory archives, and not surprisingly, finances were always a problem because they didn't get any government support. So they got it mostly through fees for students and the examination system. So it was in that lovely location, but it was kind of a rather impoverished institution. It also sat on the border of, I don't know what the cursor's not going to show, but if you see to the right side of the arrow that there's sort of a block to the east of University Avenue, which is the red road running down between University and Yonge Street and the College Street at the top and Queen Street at the bottom. So a sort of pretty big block. Which was really immigrant territory. It's home to residents over the decades, Black, Jewish, Chinese, and Italian communities. So that was largely done away with and razed, R-A-Z-E-D, when the new City Hall at Nathan Phillips Square was built. So it no longer exists, but here is a photo of what the streets look like. That was one of the central streets. So I figure that people living there weren't going to the conservatory, couldn't afford the lessons, but they could go here. And this was the University Settlement Music School in the Grange, which is near the art gallery, so it wasn't far from that area, and I couldn't find any list of students or pupils that were there. By 1929, it had 105 pupils. So I know that Boris Blin, he wrote about it, he went to teach there, and Lasserre certainly did. And of course they gave their services for free. It was that kind of place. It still exists, and I found a letter to the director of the settlement in 1995, and at Sanger, there's a donation for Madame Lasserre, which I thought was really nice. This will be familiar to you. This is kind of the second part of my story. I think it was having three parts. We just had the kind of beginning where things are developing. Everything was good. It was positive, and there was a lovely feeling of supporting. Even in the 30s and 40s, which obviously were rather difficult decades financially for the conservatory, they were struggling. And indeed, Macmillan resigned as principal in 42. Dalcroze, of course, was not well in 1950, and he passed away just days. They were organizing a big 85th birthday party for him in 1950, and Lasserre had written this lovely tribute to be read at the celebration, and of course he died just before, so they must have been sent into kind of a bit of a spin over that. One of Dalcroze's pupils, Marguerite Crozier, who is pretty much exactly contemporary with Lasserre. She was born in the same year. She'd been appointed director under the overall administrative supervision of Dalcroze's son, Gabriel. In late 1949, Crozier had written to Lasserre, who was, as I say, to say that because the conservatory was not an accredited Dalcroze school in its own right, it could not issue certificates like a London school. She referred to the London school, which she said would have authority over any Canadian school. actually, Lasser responded to that in kind of an interesting way. In an effort to maintain standards, Crozier wanted an audit of all schools teaching Dalcroze and proposed sending the 40-year-old Monica Jacquet to supervise, from Geneva, to supervise all the certificate exams for 3 years. The series of letters there, which sent both Lasser and Arnold Walter, who was head of the senior school at the Conservatory, and also the architect of power from the Conservatory, transfer of power from the Conservatory to the Faculty of Music. They were sort of aligning at this point. So the senior school was going to go to the university, not to everybody's pleasure, but there they are. Lasser pointed out that there were far closer connections with the New York School. After all, Canada wasn't sort of a slave to London at that time, which had been certifying students, Toronto students from 1934, and she said the connection with London was really not very relevant. By 1951, discussions had really not got much further. The restrictions associated with the certificate were not a fit with the fledgling music education program relying on government support, and we'll see how this comes out in the letter. Time was running out. Walter, who was really patient over this, wrote to Crozier again in 1951, explaining the situation and obviously hoping for a change of attitude for practical reasons. So he explains what he's doing here. There's a little bit more after that. And this must have, I don't know what kind of reaction they had in Geneva, but it would probably be wise to relax some of your rules and regulations and conditions prevailing in Canada. So about the holder, I'll just go, I won't read it right word for word, but holders of certificates should not be allowed to teach in other than primary schools nor in conservatories. So he then points to the funding problem, that the government would not be likely to fund something that was so restricted in terms of what people could do. And then he then points to the difference between a North American setting and a European setting, and that the whole situation was really rather different. So again, by 1952, we have the academic year 52-53, the new academic structure, the administrative structure was created. The senior school was when it transferred to the university. And on the right, Boyd Neal was appointed, again, imported from Britain actually, conductor, was not necessarily all that popular, not the first choice of many people at the Conservatory. There's a lot of scuttlebutt in this story, I'm sliding over it. He was appointed, and I remember well, I wasn't alive in 52, 53, but I certainly remember what it was like in the 70s. He was appointed head both organizations, so he held some sway at this point. It's to Walter's credit, Arnold Walter on the left, that he fully supported Lasser and Eurythmics, surprising Lasser herself. She thought he was very patient. She was surprised that he'd lasted so long trying to support her. And he also communicated with Crozier, and Lasser had actually communicated with Crozier, saying, let's strike while the iron is hot, in order to maintain the momentum that she had spent so long creating. Further eloquent appeals and an explanation of the circumstances, really by Brenda Bemis, who wrote a number of letters in support, really fell on deaf ears. And if you look at the letters from Crozier, you can see that it was all becoming rather formal. A newspaper clipping from 1954 in Lasser's paper tells all. Under the headline, "She wins $2,000," the article described how violinist Doreen Hall had been given a scholarship to study the Orff method in Salzburg and Munich with Orff himself and Gunil Kiepmann. And of course, Doreen Hall would return to Toronto to start the Orff program in 1956. So that kind of put the lid on rhythmics. The new dean, Boyd Neal, was not enthusiastic. In 1954, he wrote to Lasser, "I'm so glad you will do the solfege course next summer. As to the Eurythmics class, we feel that it is better that you should give this instruction privately." Despite the crushing disappointment of the early 1950s, Lasser remained resilient, and in addition to her regular teaching, taught at the enormously successful summer schools that had been started by Boris Blin before the war. She continued her demonstrations and also taught at a number of public schools in the city, often after school classes, but that was ongoing. Again, to move to the sort of third part, final part of my story, the conservatory moved from its old quarters, that quaint building we saw earlier, to the building that you probably know now. This is before Colonel Hall was added. She managed to commandeer, I remember this because that's when I was in her class, large basement room with 2 changing rooms, one for boys, one for girls. There's a lot of space. And she had a full roster of classes. Again, those little notebooks where I found my own name. I recognized some of the names. I even contacted some people to see if I could get some reminiscences, but that's ongoing. At the same time, this is where the University of Toronto Faculty of Music went, and that was what it looked like in '65. And unlike her colleague Boris Blin and indeed Doreen Hall, Madeleine Lasserre did not teach her. A number of teachers did and were kind of affiliated with the university, but she did teach at the Conservatory until 1977 when she retired. So what do we make of all this? As someone who lived through the final portion of the story as a student at the Royal College, the Royal Conservatory and at the Faculty of Music, I can only regret that the teaching of eurythmics was not given a higher profile within both the Conservatory and the Faculty of Music. And it was quite sad to read Madeleine Lasserre's increasingly despairing and desperate correspondence with Geneva on the future of the method of Dalcroze eurythmics in Canada. But fortunately, we have in the room, some people can attest to the ongoing nature of Dalcroze with the Dalcroze Canada, which seems to have had a new lease of life, and continuing the sort of legacy that was left by Donna Wood and Donald Himes of Brian Katz, for example, is teaching Dalcroze rhythmics. The notebooks, I think, are definitely worth a look for evolving methodology of people adapting Dalcroze's techniques. Not just in eurythmics, but in solfege. And there's, again, with the improvisation topic here, it became too vast to kind of go through all her ideas. But they are certainly a valuable glimpse into that teaching method over half a century and to the legacy of our own Canadian pioneer, Madeleine Lasserre. Thank you.
Well, it's a great privilege to be here and to be able to talk to you about Brenda Beament, and thanks to Selma for organizing this little gathering today where we can share what has happened in Canada in the early days. I met Brenda in the late 1980s. She was already 75 years old at the time. I had been studying that summer at Angers with Lisa, and Lisa told me that there was a Dalcroze teacher in Ottawa. And I remember saying, really? And she said, yes. She gave me her name. I found her name in the telephone book. I called her and she said, oh my dear, we need to have lunch tomorrow. And 3 days later, I was starting lesson with her. But by that time, she was also an Alexander teacher. So she said, we need to do both. So every Friday morning, I would go to her place, we would go to her studio, and we would have a Dalcroze lesson, followed by the Alexander lesson. And eventually, to those lessons was added a swim. She had a swimming pool for that. As she got to know me better, then afternoon tea was there. So eventually, the lesson stopped, but not the afternoon tea. That stayed until the end of her life. So I was very fortunate to have been her last Dalcroze student and also her last Alexander student. So I have good memories of that. So I'll start with just a quick brief pictures to introduce you to her background. So she was born in Dundee, Scotland. Her mother was English, her father was Scottish, but she very much identified as a Scottish person. You will see here, this is Brenda, the little girl with her 3 brothers, and they're all wearing the little Scottish kilt, and that was very much part of who she was. Very early on, she was introduced to drama. So we have many pictures of her doing drama. This is her in the little white dress, and this is her also in that little man there. And it was a very good preparation for the type of very elaborated performances she would do at Dalcroze eventually in Ottawa. There was a number of them, and that was very much where it got started. This is again one of her drama, and she's in the middle. She's the little fee, what's fee? Fairy in the middle, so that's where she is. Now, Brenda started Eurythmics as a child in Dundee, Scotland. There was some teaching there in her school. She started as a child, and she even did the production and was featured in the newspaper at the time. She is the one in the middle. And the little caption was saying, a group of dancing girls in a scene from Clair de Lune, one of the ballet in the Café Chantant to be held in the church house of the St. Paul's Cathedral, Dundee. And it was done as a fundraising at that time. Then she went to London, so she was at the School of Dalcroze in London for some years, and that's where she got her certificate. And the year she got her certificate, in July 1934, Jacques Dalcroze was there as the visiting principal, so he is the one who allowed her, and following that, he gave her a scholarship to go to Geneva. So it was a scholarship coming from her that got Brenda ready to go to Geneva. Now, it was quite uncommon at that time, especially in Scotland, to let a girl go by herself and studied in Geneva. But her father and her uncle had studied in Lausanne as part of the scholarship they had, so they felt that Switzerland was very safe and it would be very good for Brenda. Now, her father changed his mind after she was there for a year when he saw pictures and realized that she was in the presence of that man with short sleeves and barefoot. He had not realized that there would be a man present in the room because so far Brenda has always done Eurythmics with other females, so that was quite a shock. But by that time, she had already been established in the program. That's her class. So she's one of the girls in the class that's working there. And that was Mr. Jacques and some of the students as well, as they were talking at the end of the production. She got her diploma in June 26, 1935. You will recognize the name, of course, of Mr. Jacques, Franck Martin, and some others that you might already know and that would be there. Then Brenda went back to London and she started her career. She opened a children's music studio, and there were 3 of them. And the little flyer says, the best musical environment is one in which all aspects of music are equally considered. And this is achieved by lessons in Dalcroze Eurythmics, singing, or training, instrumental playing. Such a comprehensive syllabus should prove of real value in the musical education of children. It was quite a big school, and they had established little schools all around London, so it was not just that main space. But then the activities ended when the war started, so of course all activities had to stop. Brenda returned home for that period of time to be outside of London, and then another chapter of her life started. What happened at the time is that Brenda was in her late 20s. She had been studying, she had been to Geneva, she had started her career and was just waiting for the war to finish to go back to England, to London, and to reopen the school. She had never thought of a wedding or a marriage, but her family was. And her brothers particularly were thought it was very important to find someone suitable for her. So at one point they sent a letter home and they said that they were coming for Christmas and that they were bringing that very nice Canadian military, and they wanted her to be nice to him. And of course, Telbinad arrived, was introduced to the families, spent the afternoon there, and at the end of the afternoon he asked Brenda for tea the next day. And Brenda always said, I knew he was going to propose. And that's exactly what happened. The next day she went for tea and he proposed. And then, of course, Ted went back to war. He was quite an important general in the army, and he went back to war. Then he came back for the wedding in February. When her grandchildren would ask about how short the courtship was, Brenda would say, well, my dear, there was a war going on. So they got married. You can see Brenda wearing a beautiful dress. Those were recycled curtains from the neighbor because it's a very difficult time during the war. And they got married, and then Ted left the next day. So during the war, there would often be times where people would say, and Brenda, what does your husband think about this or that? Because that's the proper way to ask things. And she would say, I have no idea. I don't know my husband. Ted was responsible, her husband was responsible for the débarquement, the D-Day, when the Canadian delegation arrived on the French coast. So he was there quite late. He was quite an important figure. And after the war, he did stay another year and a half for the area of war and everything. By that time, Brenda had 2 children, Justin and Mariel, and they were ready to go back to move to Ottawa. It was quite a shock for Brenda because you know that Ottawa, before being the capital, was a lumberjack town, and it became the capital just because of the decision of Queen Victoria, who decided that it was a good spot on the map. It was far from the Americans, not too close to Montreal, and that's how it was decided to be the capital of Canada. So when Brenda arrived, there was not much of a cultural life in Ottawa, and certainly not much activity going on in terms of concert halls or anything of that. So Brenda arrives with her idea of starting Dalcroze lessons, and she was very successful with it. She started the year after she arrived, and she has a group of young girls that started in her programs. And actually, while she taught different groups, she taught in daycare centers, she taught in many demonstrations or group lessons, there is that group of girls, there were about 12 of them, who stayed with her for a good 10 years. And those are the ones we're going to talk about because what happened is that Brenda wrote a diary at the end of those 10 years to talk about the experience that went over those 10 years. And it is quite lovely, so I'll read a little snippet about what she was saying. So at the very beginning, she started by saying, they met in the studio each Tuesday, left by their mothers. The little 6 and 7 years old will scramble into their tunics, pulling off their shoes and socks. The lesson would start with the minimum of verbal instruction. The piano would speak instead, playing rapid or slow notes, loudly or softly, which the children would follow by stepping. And then she ends on that section by saying, after a year, these beginners gave a very simple demonstration at an Ottawa children concert. And that was the beginning of a series of presentations that she would do every year. Now, of course, what did she do after that very first concert? She took a picture, wrote a letter, and sent that to Mr. Jacques. And he replied back with a little letter that Brenda kept, where he said, my chère Brenda, merci pour la belle photographie et bravo pour ta belle activité et pour tes succès. Je pense souvent à toi et je te remercie pour ta fidélité et pour ta collaboration. Je te souhaite grand succès, bonne santé et bon courage et je t'embrasse bien cordialement, ton vieux maître affectionné, Émile Jacques Dalcroze. So the second year, on a very snowy day, they started the Greek legend of Persephone. So that was the big production that they developed with the Greek maidens and Pluto and Hades, and there was a lot of activities going on, and the whole production was built up with an orchestra, because she wanted to have the different themes, and she wanted to have all that music that would be supporting the production they were doing in Plastiques Animées. So it was very much covered by the media. It was quite a big event. And here, it's not a very good picture, but it was in the media at the time, one of the main newspaper in Ottawa, and they are talking about the prayer to Pluto and the big characters that were presented and how the children were 7 and 8 and 10 years old, and there were about 60 people that were appearing at one time or another. That was quite successful, so the following year the National Film Board, which is the federal kind of cultural film board that produced a lot of arts movies, they made a movie of that production. Brenda was not very satisfied because she always felt it was lacking that simplicity and the nice freshness of children that was kind of lost with the production of the film, but it had gathered quite a bit of interest. Then the following year, they got to work with the Tudor Singers, which are quite an important singing group in Canada, and they had accepted to come and work with the children, so then the children had to learn those beautiful ebbs, and the flow of these voices demanded greater fluidity of movement, keener appreciation of light and shade, and the ability to follow the different vocal lines. And for the Christmas performance, Brenda in no time had the whole family involved in the project. The fathers were taking parts as shepherds and kings, and the mothers were sewing medieval garments. And they did that production with the Tudor Singers, of course, and the choir boys of the Saint Albert de Martyrs Church. So it was quite a large production again. The following year, they were asked to give a presentation in Kingston, which is about 2.5 hours from Ottawa, between Ottawa and Toronto. And Brenda decided that they would do their first performance of Gustav Holst's Fire and Water. So there was quite, again, an elaborated work that they did together to make that possible. Now, Brenda also, yes?
It's fun.
Okay. Now Brenda also had the idea that you needed to have a summer house. So in her cottage in Kingsmere, that is now Chelsea, she would have her summer camp. So the piano would be moved on the front porch, and the children would have their lesson on the grass, and that will last for a good 3 weeks. And you see another production of another photos of that. And Henrietta Rosentraff would come from Pittsburgh and bring all their percussion instruments. So instead of being having movement with just the piano, now they were exposed to the castanets and the clarinets and the gongs and the drums and the triangle. So that lasted for a few years, and they even wrote a book together that went after that kind of work they did. Then one of the other big production was the Festival of the Annunciation. So that was quite a big thing she did. She arranged pieces from the microcosmos and arranged it with the whole nativity and the flight to Egypt and the Holy Families. And so it was a number of tableaux that was put together with her huge crowd of young persons. And then their last work was actually a poem from Brenda Campbell's Scott. And Brenda is describing that by that time she felt that they had internalized so much of the music, the phrase, the beat, the inflection, the mood, that they were now ready to perform without music, just guided by the melody and the musicality of the poetry. So the poetry was being read, and the performance happened outside, and they did quite a big production for their last day. Now, just a side note as we end, Brenda was also involved in a number of other things. While she did her Eurythmic classes, she got involved with Joan Haynes, and they published a book, a song for young children, in 1954. before. She was also very much involved on the board of the Ontario Registered Music Teachers Association, and that's where she gave a lot of presentation. And she was instrumental in starting the Ottawa Morning Music Club, which was the very first concert hall for professional musicians. And that was a number of years before the National Arts Centre, which is the first major hall, was established in 1967 in Ottawa. So she was quite influential in bringing a lot of musicians and providing the opportunity for many people in Ottawa to get that music. Then in the 1960s, at the age of 55, Brenda Beeman made a career change. She had had cervical problems for a number of years, and she had done some Alexander lessons, and it had been extremely beneficial for her. So she returned back to London, and she did a training that was 3 years full-time at that time, so she reconnected with London and got her diploma in 1970, and then she opened her practice in Ottawa. She was also one of the founding members of the Canadian Society of Teachers of the Alexander Technique. And as we're finishing, I have 2 slides of pictures of Brenda in her last Dalcroze Eurythmics class. She was 88 at the time, and she had accepted to give a class to a group of adult students. So we got pictures of her teaching her last class that was in Ottawa. And to end, well, we could say that eventually the circle turned around because by the 2000, it was time for the new generation of the Beemans to be involved with the Dalcroze method. So Brenda's grandson, Dominique, who is a Montessori teacher, did a series of classes specifically designed for music teachers, and they were taught by Louise Mathieu and Donald Hines, and here you can see Donald at the piano. They were the Studia Musica Institute, a summer training school that I was running at the Orford Center for 10 years. And at the same time, Brenda's great-grandson, Oliver, was taking Dalcroze lessons with Wendy Taxis at the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto. And when Brenda passed away, her granddaughter Ariana wrote a little text in the Globe and Mail in Toronto that reads like this: "Familiar melodies and rhythms can bring long-forgotten experiencing bubbling to the surface. So it was as I listened to my young son's music class recently. The teacher was playing a simple rhythm tune on the piano as the children ran around on tiptoe, spreading their arms wide. This was the same music that my grandmother would play on her piano as my 2 brothers and I whistled around in her studio on Sunday afternoon, first tiptoeing, then marching and galloping, depending on where the rhythm sends us." And that was in December 2004. That was Brenda in her having tea afternoon.
What did you have for tea in Ottawa?
Well, Brenda, it was the Earl Grey black tea. But the big discussion was always milk before pouring the tea or milk after pouring the tea. And I was always a bit of a stranger because I didn't put any milk, you know. So Brenda would have another teapot where the tea would not be as steep because she couldn't believe I could drink the steep black tea as it was.
Wow, that's
It was
elaborate.
quite an ordeal.
And the china, was it from Scotland or?
Oh, the china. The china was the china that was over 200 years old.
No.
And it had been brought from Scotland, and a lot of it has been handmade.
Wow.
It's all at the Museum of Civilization in Ottawa now after she passed away. So she had traveled with that, and she had this big teapot and the small teapot, and all the plates. It was quite beautiful. Yeah, she was quite
I still haven't been to that museum, but now I have an excuse.
Yes, that's right.
Sheila, I wondered, our teacher, Elizabeth Van der Spar, she talked about Brenda Beeman a lot,
Yes.
but we never met her. I mean, obviously they must have met when they were training.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and a couple of years later, when I went again to Langer, Elisabeth van der Spa was the guest teacher that summer, and she was talking extensively on Brenda, and they were writing. Look, Brenda would say, oh, I got a letter from Elizabeth yesterday, and she would show me the letter and the books, and when Laura Campbell wrote her improvisation book, Elisabeth van der Spa promoted those through Brenda, so they were sent to Canada, and I got copies. Yeah, so it would have been in those
Yes.
days where, yeah.
No, I'm just saying, well, because we should re-enter, I should close the whole program, I think, and read.
Any other questions?
So this is where my colleagues read, so now if I go to.
One thing we did notice when, earlier at the opening ceremonies, when Louise Mathieu was talking about Lucien Brochu and the kind of history of Dalcroze here, and we immediately, well, Gilles went to talk to Monsieur Brochu afterwards to find out more, and it's interesting how it was such a different story for here some years later, I guess about 20 years later after what there was Marguerite Fortier, whose name my ears immediately pricked up.
Yeah, because she was the director of the institute when he got interested in eurythmics. So I guess he first contacted the people in Geneva, and the first contact he had was with her.
But she was much more positive then than she had been for the Toronto.
But there is still something for me that is not. I'm not sure that he got the right name. I'm wondering if it was not Clarisse Dutoit that he contacted, because I talked with Ursula and Marianne, and I asked them who was the director at the time, and I said, was it Crozier? And they say no, it was Clarisse
It was
Dutoit.
Claire Dutoit.
So maybe he had contact with Crozier somehow. I don't know where, but I have the feeling that when he contacted the institute at the time, in the 70s, to have people come
I think it was
here,
changed by then, yes.
I think it was Clarisse Dutoit, but we'll check that to
That
be
is an
sure.
interesting
It
story,
will make
interesting
sense though if
correlation.
it
Yes,
was, yeah.
it would.
Now, of course, the very big difference is that in this case, he was interested to have a program and her agreed to hire new two teachers. The same proposition was done to Toronto, but they already had Brenda and Madame Lassalle,
Well, what they were going
no
to-
money to get.
Well, what they wanted to do, they asked, I think the idea was that they thought that she might be a bit outdated, and they wanted to we can finish up, but it was
This is slightly different. Let me see if I can advance it. Okay, all right, so this is odd, but we will work with it as it is. Why that happened. So let's turn to Donald Hines, who was Lasserre's student in the 1950s. He came to Toronto already a pianist, and he was teaching piano at the Conservatory when he met her and began to do rhythmics. And she encouraged him. He studied with her about 2 years, but very rapidly went to Geneva and studied intensively and became certified to teach. And he then taught at the Royal Conservatory of Music and the National Ballet School, where in 1959, when he returned after his time in Geneva, he was there at the very beginning of the National Ballet School when it opened in 1959. The very first lesson taught in the school was his Dalcroze class. And in addition to 50 years of teaching in Ontario's schools, conservatories, and universities, Donald Hines was a highly regarded pianist, Dalcroze teacher, of course, dancer, choreographer, composer, and Feldenkrais practitioner. And I'm going to give a more sort of telegraphic sense of his amazing career because of our time situation. But I would like to give you a few views of his work. Let's see if I can move onward. In this picture, you can see him as a teacher at the School of Toronto Dance Theatre, probably in the 70s, with his wonderful teaching posture, which I remember very well. His way of turning from the piano with a gesture and communicating about what people were listening to. This is very Donald, this image. But this is the Donald of the 60s, who, after his time in Geneva, came back to Toronto and his first teaching, but also he was training actively as a dancer. He began to study with Yoni Bettys, who ran a studio in Toronto, and in whose studio some of the first members and founders of the Toronto Dance Theatre met up and worked together. And so in the reflection in the mirror, you see Donald in the middle. That's tall and strong Donald, who at this time is becoming a fully trained practicing dancer. And behind him, gesturing toward the mirror, is David Earle, who was also there, who became one of the major choreographers, one of the founders of the Toronto Dance Theatre, and who was his close friend. So the connections between Donald and the dance world intensified during the years that he was coming into his prime as a Dalcroze teacher. In this image, you can see him working with one of his most beloved productions. He created the production of Babar with dancers of the School of Toronto Dance Theatre, and here he is showing visiting school children, probably backstage, a view of Babar. He also, in this part of his career, began working on the extremely popular CBC television program called Mr. Dress-Up, for which he composed the theme song, which actually was recently played on the radio. I happened to hear it the other day. It was a distinctive tune, and he would play live at the studio for the first years of production. So he had a kind of total career going across performance areas. Finally, this is a picture showing him as he looked around the time I met him. When I moved to Toronto in 1972, I immediately went to take class at the School of Toronto Dance Theatre to get a Graham class. And within a couple of weeks of moving to Toronto, I went to his class, and expecting it to be a taught Graham class. But it was actually Donald teaching the class and playing the class. It was a remarkable experience because he was able to do it all. He was able to teach us the movement, which we, in some cases, already were familiar with, but he was able to make the music connect to the Graham technique class in a way that was really extraordinary. That was something that would be hard to forget. He also was very involved in the world of the Toronto Dance Theatre, for which he was not only a dancer performer, he was also a class accompanist. He worked with the main artists of the company very closely in terms of playing for them. He composed, he collaborated with Anne Southam on a work, and he was totally enveloped really in the world of dance as a performer. He lived in the worlds of music and movement very completely, as very few people are able to do. I often ran into Donald at performances, both music concerts and dance performances, and we became good colleagues, I would say, in the sense that we would communicate about what was important to go see, we would actually phone up or send emails to point out something very important. And I got to know him in one other way later in his teaching life. This would have been in the early 80s, when he was teaching an adult course at the Royal Conservatory of Music, which I was able to take. So having already studied there with Elizabeth Morton, who was another very important Canadian-based but London School of Dalcroze rhythmic trained dancer, teacher, I was able to be Donald's student. He had been teaching actually at York University in the early 70s, but it wasn't possible for me to teach my full load in the dance department and be in his courses, so it was only later that I was able to be his student. But it was quite exciting to work with him in a kind of weekly ongoing way with a small group of serious students. And then yet again, a couple of more decades later, the Plastique Animée group had become active in Toronto. And I'll just show you a few images of other people in the scene. Donald was very involved in collaborative ventures of all kinds, and he thrived on working with others. So I would like to show you, first of all, a little flash of his sense of humor, his laughter, which everyone adored. And then a couple of the people he worked very closely with. Gilles mentioned already Wendy Taxis, who is here teaching in the studio of the Conservatory where you studied, where Donald taught us, and where she was teaching children. It was this large room that Lasserre had gotten hold of. And also, another part of this picture was Donna Wood, who became quite an important leader in early childhood music education. She was another Lasserre student who became part of a small community of people who would support each other for things like workshops, for guest teachers, for all kinds of things. She published this book. And another of the key colleagues who helped Donald move the activity ahead in the 1980s and 90s, Mariana Kotick, who is working here with children at Seneca College. Mariana already had become qualified by studying in Laval in the program in the 70s. She was from Toronto but had studied at York and then also at the Laval program here. So she returned to Toronto and began teaching and was part of the Donald Circle. Finally, Brian, who's over there, was one of the stalwart people involved in continuing the energy, the Dalcroze endeavors through a changing scene. The changing scene had to do with things Dorothy has already hinted at, which is the financial world of the conservatory, the ups and downs of the conservatory. So we'll pause for a moment to shift to the Laval story for a moment or two, and then see how people reconnected, how, in a sense, Louise Mathieu and Donald connected in a later period to lead to the present. So I'm moving to Laval, which I'm just in the interest of speed. I'm going to read one of the brief statements in the micro exhibit, which I hope you have a chance to go see. We made a 2-panel micro exhibit on Dalcroze rhythmics in Canada, which is over with the larger exhibit in the library. So I'll say quickly that Laval University in Quebec offered Dalcroze rhythmics as envisioned by Lucien Brochu head of the School of Music, beginning in 1970. And so here you can see a group of students in that period. This is a picture of the energy of the 70s, certainly located by Sandra Nash, who had more images. I was able to locate several different sources, so this is one that I especially like and included in our micro exhibit. Another showing improvisation at the keyboard, and a group picture here of children in a public school in Quebec, working in a teaching practicum led by Laval students. This is actually Sandra, around 1980, when she was able to teach here, and who remembers it as a formative experience, the opportunity to teach here. And I think that that's one of the most interesting features of the Laval program. It was not only extraordinary as a place where a baccalaureate program and dedicated program in eurythmics was offered from 1972 to 1981, followed by an evolving program and a changing program that continues to this day. But also it was a place where the development of teachers was occurring, because Sandra was changing in her ways of teaching. Ursula, who actually was one of the two teachers that you met on the opening ceremony, who came here to initiate the program, it was becoming a specialist in the Gerda Alexander approach, which is not to be confused with the FM Alexander approach, which Brenda became a specialist in, but a different somatic specialist approach. And in the area of, as she put it in titling, she made a beautiful film actually that was titled, translated to English, Tuning the Body to Music. And she began developing work in the connections of the Jacques Dalcroze background she already had with the Gerda Alexander work. And then, in a couple more decades, she was able to initiate advanced training, a master's program, which has been very successful in the recent past. So that has been an expansion here. Louise is quite a pathfinder who, as you heard the other night, was a student originally in the program, and who then pursued all the advanced training through her Dalcroze studies, but also who went for a doctorate at New York University in the early 80s, and finished a degree with her research on improvisation in music and dance, her dissertation in 1984. And so actually I think one of the most important things about the Laval program was the encouragement of advanced study and research by the faculty, who continued to grow and advance their own careers. Certainly at the time Louise did her degree, she was one of the very first people who was a practitioner in the method, who was also receiving an advanced degree. So let's look here. This is the more recent past, where probably thanks to Gilles, and I believe, I don't know, maybe Louise can set us straight, when and how you connected with Donald working together, but I know that you were doing it in Orford in the 90s, I guess. And then it was quite important to people working in Toronto that Louise began to connect more actively and come frequently to Toronto. And here's a workshop situation from around 2009, I think, where Donald is in the upper left and Louise is in the lower right. And then other people that you may know, one of whom is actually over here. Sherry is in this room in the lower left. Daniel Rubinoff is here, and Chang Kang is here, and Anne is here, right over there. So we began having a kind of merging where the fruits of the Laval program came to Toronto, in a sense, through.
That was a workshop, I think.
No, I think that was.
Yeah, that was a workshop.
It was a workshop, that's right.
Was it? Okay. I would have said it was a plastic anime.
Well, it was a plastique in a workshop, I would say. But this is the later version of Marianne Katek, who has been important in many, many ways. She reconnected with Brittany and became, she recently completed her master's degree here in that program, but she also, over a period of time, working closely with Donald and colleagues, activated a plastique anime group, which did a number of studies. I was part of this group for most of its time, and we were very fortunate to have this situation of development with people from different directions in several different years, starting around 2008. This is 2008. Chang Feng, you might recognize. Donald, Sherry is working with Donald in the middle. Janice Lindskog, a harpist. It was an extraordinary gift. This is our group working in one of the beautiful studios of the National Ballet School, which was welcoming and which is where the current training program has a very fine location and home. This is a photograph of Jamie, who's sitting over here, who is a flutist, who was playing for us, actually. This is a plastique made with the work Syrinx, which is quite a beautiful piece. And finally, here you have a sort of sense of the current energy, just as it's beginning to shift gears, having been sort of challenged by the Conservatory, which said, we don't want you anymore, essentially. So it moved. Laura Ono, the organizing hero of the present time, is in the middle of this group. This is in her small studio, and this is when, in about 2010, the group moved out and moved on, and Dalcroze Canada began to administer a much needed new approach to teacher training and qualification, which has grown ever since. I also, though, am going to make a couple of quick additional points because,
5 minutes.
right. Well, we didn't start on time. We started more than 10 minutes late. So are we followed by another group at 5?
We have to go.
There's another presentation.
Okay, so I'm going to point out just very quickly by showing you an image of Martine Epoch from, you remember from the opening, with her book about Le Groupe Nouvelaire. The influences of Dalcroze in Canada go in many directions, in circles going into fields such as dance. Monique was responsible for developing a whole generation of creativity in the Quebec dance scene. And others working in settings such as York University. This is Hetty Van Manen teaching at York. Also, Karen Greenhead taught as guest artist at York. Have benefited hugely from the presence of Dalcroze. And finally, I'll just mention a few others. The situation of people such as Joan Rayside, who was London trained and who came back to Canada. She came finally to British Columbia, is evocative of the sort of lost careers of others who should be found and remembered. She composed for children, she wrote books for children, and she kept a detailed memoir of her studies in England and in Geneva, which her son has just been finding and sending to me. There's a need for the materials of this kind that people still have, and the stories of people who are less well remembered, for these to be archived, collected, and cared for. And one of the ways that this might happen will be through collections, such as the collection of Dance Collection Dance, which I asked Claire to share some details about, who are actively interested in these traces of teachers and their activities. So if you are aware of people whose stories might need to be collected through oral history or through helping people make depositive collections of music, etc., you should let me know, because I know they are able to do this. And also the Dalcroze Canada website is very interested in making resources available online. In addition, the activity of people in publishing in research has been notable in Canada. I think you will become aware of all of that. And also the potential for web exhibition, which we hope will grow from the micro exhibit that's over at the library. So I guess we're finished.